History calls these men geniuses. Fair enough. They crossed oceans, named coastlines, and redrew the map of the world. They also got lost, believed nonsense, brought the dumbest supplies imaginable, and turned legendary expeditions into slow-motion disasters. Here are 32 brutally stupid mistakes by history's smartest explorers, proof that talent and common sense are not the same thing. 1. Captain James Cook could read oceans like other people read street signs. He mapped enormous stretches of the globe, survived reefs, storms, and ice, and looked basically unbeatable. Then Hawaii happened, and suddenly the great navigator lost to timing so bad it deserves its own warning label. On his first arrival, many Hawaiians connected him to the god Lono and treated him with huge respect. Then Cook sailed away, got forced back by ship repairs, and returned during a sacred period when Lono was absolutely not supposed to be showing up. So the man who had entered like a divine VIP came back looking more like an awkward fraud who ignored the calendar. Tension exploded on the beach, a fight broke out, and one of history's greatest explorers died because he accidentally turned himself from honored guest into the worst possible festival interruption. 2. In the 19th century, a bunch of very confident men became obsessed with the idea of an open polar sea, which sounds less like science and more like something invented during a fever dream. The theory claimed that beyond the Arctic ice ring there was a warm, navigable ocean just waiting to be found. Elisha Kent Kane fell for this nonsense hard. He pushed deep into the Arctic, convinced that any day now, the ice would part and reveal a magical watery paradise. Spoiler, it did not. His ship froze in place. His men suffered through starvation, frostbite, and total misery, and the grand discovery turned into a frozen nightmare. Kane kept chasing an imaginary sea, while reality kept punching him directly in the face with wind, ice, and suffering. It was not exploration anymore, it was stubbornness dressed up as science. 3. Sir Francis Drake loved 3 things: sailing, glory, and making Spain grind its teeth. So during his world voyage, when he reached the coast of California, he repaired his ship, planted an English flag, named the region New Albion, and claimed a gigantic slice of North America for Queen Elizabeth. Bold move, monumental energy. And then he did absolutely nothing with it. No colony, no fort, no permanent settlement. Not even a decent follow-up. He basically rolled up, declared ownership of a massive territory, and then sailed away like a man who wrote "mine" on someone else's sandwich and never came back. The Spanish, who were much closer and much more serious about keeping territory, were not exactly trembling over this grand gesture. Drake's claim was the explorer version of a dramatic social media post with zero action behind it. Big announcement, no plan, end of story. 4. Burke and Wills survived one of the harshest journeys in Australian exploration, crawled their way back toward safety, and then committed the kind of decision that feels almost too ridiculous to be real. They were near their supply camp, near food, near rescue, near not dying. And instead of making the final push immediately, they decided to stop and rest. Just one little break, one little pause, one catastrophic nap-shaped mistake. When they finally reached the camp, it was empty. The rescue party had left that very same morning. They missed survival by about 9 hours, which is the cruelest deadline extension history never granted. This was not some dramatic defeat by nature alone. This was procrastination with body count. The outback was brutal, yes, but Burke and Wills still managed to lose a race against time while standing practically at the finish line. 5. When people imagine crossing harsh Australian country, they picture rugged determination, survival instincts, and maybe one good idea. Burke and Wills brought camels, which sounds smart for about 5 seconds. Yes, camels handle deserts well. Australia, however, is not one giant neat sandbox. It has mud, scrub, rough bush, and all kinds of terrain that turns camel feet into a design flaw. The animals struggled, bogged down, and quickly became less like heroic transport and more like expensive, grumpy luggage. It was one of those plans that seems brilliant on paper until the continent itself starts laughing. Then came the final insult. Once the camels stopped being useful as transport, the starving explorers started eating them. So the animals meant to help conquer the journey ended up as desperate rations. Imagine bringing your expedition strategy along, only to eventually serve it for dinner. That is grim efficiency with a side of humiliation. 6. Christopher Columbus had an impressively toxic relationship with mathematics. To sail his westward voyage, he needed Earth to be smaller than it actually was. So instead of respecting numbers, he basically bullied them until they said what he wanted. He cherry-picked ancient estimates, ignored better calculations, and presented a version of the globe where the ocean between Europe and Asia looked suspiciously manageable. That alone was reckless enough. But after landing, he doubled down like a man allergic to being corrected. He became convinced Cuba was part of mainland China and forced his crew to sign statements swearing that it was true. Not because evidence supported it, but because Columbus said so, and apparently that was meant to end the discussion. It was pure boss-level delusion. Imagine arriving somewhere unfamiliar, guessing wildly, then demanding legal paperwork to protect your bad guess from reality. That was Columbus in full form. 7. Vasco da Gama finally reached India after an extraordinary voyage and got the chance to make a first impression on one of the richest courts on Earth. This was the diplomatic moment, the grand entrance, the introduction of Europe to a ruler whose wealth made most kings look like they were saving coins in a sock. And Vasco showed up with gifts so underwhelming they sound like leftovers from a failed market stall. Cheap cloth, hats, wash basins. He sailed across oceans to impress a spectacularly rich court with the kind of items that suggest someone forgot the real presents at home. Local officials were embarrassed before the meeting even properly began and reportedly thought the gifts were too pathetic to present. Imagine crossing half the world only to reveal that your sense of royal gift etiquette is basically clueless uncle at a bargain shop. Great navigator, legendary voyage, absolutely tragic present selection. 8. Gerardus Mercator was a cartographic genius, the kind of man whose name still haunts classroom wall maps to this day. But brilliance clearly does not stop the human brain from occasionally sprinting off a cliff. Mercator became convinced that the North Pole was home to a giant black magnetic mountain called Rupes Nigra. Not just that. He also imagined a massive whirlpool dragging ocean waters inward and 4 surrounding landmasses split by powerful rivers. This was not scribbled in a drunken tavern notebook. He put versions of this nonsense onto serious maps. One of history's greatest mapmakers looked at the unknown north and basically created a fantasy setting with bonus geology. It sounds less like scientific geography and more like a place a wizard sends you to recover a cursed crystal. Mercator could map the world brilliantly, yet still stare into uncertainty and confidently invent something that belonged in myth, not navigation. 9. George Gray thought he was being clever during his Australian expedition. He buried supplies for the return trip, probably feeling like a tactical mastermind who had finally outsmarted the wilderness. Hide food now, recover it later, survive elegantly. Very nice plan. Unfortunately, he forgot to consult the local experts. And by experts, I mean ants. When Gray came back hungry and exhausted, the stash had been absolutely demolished. The insects had not merely sampled the food. They had gone full apocalypse. Flour gone, sugar gone, leather bags eaten, corks from bottles chewed through like the whole thing was an all-you-can-devour buffet. Imagine being beaten in strategic planning by creatures that can be stepped on by accident. Gray got outmaneuvered by tiny 6-legged raiders with the organizational skills of a military unit and the appetite of a demolition crew. It was not just bad luck. It was a complete, humiliating defeat by the smallest thieves on Earth. 10. Marco Polo's travel writing is full of wonders, but every now and then it reads like a man describing the natural world after being lied to by fairy tales. When he reached Sumatra, he thought he had finally found a unicorn. At last, the legendary creature, the elegant beast of myth, the symbol of beauty and magic. What he actually found was a rhinoceros, and his reaction was basically outrage. He complained that it was ugly, muddy, brutish, and shaped all wrong, as if the animal had personally failed a casting call. Imagine staring at a gigantic armored tank with a horn on its face and deciding the main issue is that it lacks sparkle. Marco Polo did not discover a disappointing beast. He discovered that medieval imagination had wildly oversold the unicorn brand. The rhinoceros was out there minding its own prehistoric business, while Polo wrote the earliest recorded version of "This looked better in the brochure." 11. Robert Falcon. Scott's South Pole expedition is packed with grim decisions, but one stands above the rest like a monument to terrible planning. Instead of relying mainly on sled dogs, which were already the proven champions of polar travel, Scott brought Siberian ponies to Antarctica. Because apparently someone looked at endless ice, brutal winds, deep snow, and lethal cold and thought, what this place needs is hooves. The results were disastrous. The ponies sank into soft snow, struggled in the freezing conditions, required bulky feed, and quickly turned from transport into problem. They were exhausted, slowed the expedition, and eventually died. Then the nightmare got darker. Their bodies were butchered and stored as food for later use, turning the failed transport strategy into emergency meat supply. Scott's expedition was tragic for many reasons, but choosing ponies for Antarctic hauling remains one of the most baffling acts of optimism ever committed against common sense. 12. Fabian von Bellingshausen got so close to Antarctica that most people would spend the rest of their lives bragging about it. He sailed near the Antarctic mainland, saw immense ice cliffs rising in the distance, and wrote about an ice shore of extreme height, which is technically accurate, but also hilariously undercooked for what may have been one of the greatest sights in exploration history. This was not some random patch of frozen scenery. This was a continent-sized revelation sitting right in front of him, and Bellingshausen reacted with the energy of a man noticing a decent hedge on his morning walk. No dramatic claim, no triumphant declaration, no giant moment of recognition, just a sort of polite observational shrug before moving on. It is the historical equivalent of standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon and noting in your diary, "Ground appears somewhat lower over there." He nearly touched a colossal discovery and somehow treated it like background decoration. 13. Henry Hudson was good enough at exploration to get a river, a strait, and an enormous bay named after him, which sounds glorious until you remember how his final voyage ended. Hudson pushed his crew through a brutal Arctic winter, kept exploring when they wanted survival, and generally managed the group with the charm of a man who thought mutiny was just constructive feedback. His starving, freezing crew finally snapped. Instead of continuing under his leadership, they shoved Hudson, his teenage son, and a few loyal men into a small open boat and set them adrift in the giant icy bay that now carries his name. That is not merely a bad ending. That is a career review written in pure hatred. Hudson did not lose to weather alone. He lost because he managed to become so intolerable that his crew preferred the Arctic itself over another day of taking orders from him. A remarkable explorer, yes, but apparently an absolutely unbearable boss. 14. Giovanni da Verrazano was an accomplished explorer and mapmaker, which makes the ending of his career feel even more brutal. During a later voyage in the Caribbean, he spotted an island that looked peaceful enough and decided to go ashore with a small party. His crew had doubts, which should normally be filed under important survival clues, but confidence overruled caution. Verrazano rode in anyway, apparently expecting diplomacy, curiosity, maybe a friendly exchange. What he got was the worst possible correction. The islanders attacked, killed him, dismembered him, and according to later reports, cooked and ate him in full view of the horrified crew still aboard the ship. They could do nothing but watch their captain become a beachfront nightmare. It is one of exploration history's most savage lessons in misplaced confidence. Sometimes, they seem friendly is not a strategy. Sometimes it is your final catastrophic misreading of the room. 15. James Bruce marched back into Europe convinced he had solved one of geography's greatest mysteries, the source of the Nile. After enduring years of hardship in Africa, he reached Lake Tana in Ethiopia, found the springs feeding it, and declared victory with the confidence of a man already hearing applause. Tiny issue, though. He had identified the source of the Blue Nile, not the full and ultimate source of the entire Nile system. The White Nile, which matters quite a lot in this story, remained far away and unresolved. But Bruce was not about to let accuracy interrupt his personal parade. He wrote his account, claimed the glory, and essentially marketed a partial answer as the answer. It was a bit like finding one hallway in a huge mansion and announcing you had discovered the whole building. Impressive journey, genuine achievement, spectacular overclaim. Exploration history has many bold men, but Bruce treated technical details like annoying background noise. 16. Francisco de Orellana set out on an expedition to find El Dorado, the legendary city of gold, which already meant the plan had one foot in fantasy. Then things went sideways in the jungle, supplies ran low, and Orellana was sent downriver with a small group to find food and return quickly. That was the assignment. Fetch provisions. Maybe save everyone. Instead, he kept going, and going, and going. Whether he was lost, realistic enough to realize the main expedition was doomed, or simply too deep into the current to turn back, the result was absurdly historic. He drifted down the full length of the Amazon River and emerged into the Atlantic, becoming the first European to navigate that colossal waterway almost by accident. The man basically left to find groceries and came back with one of the greatest geographical achievements of the era. It is the finest example of failing your mission so successfully that history still gives you a medal. 17. Vitus Bering was put in charge of one of the biggest and most expensive exploration projects of his time. Huge resources, massive expectations, serious imperial backing, scientific goals, the whole impressive package. He was supposed to help map Siberia's Far East and clarify whether Asia and North America were connected. Instead, after years of hardship, his ship wrecked on a miserable, treeless island, and Bering died there from scurvy. Scurvy, the classic sailor disaster. The old, embarrassingly preventable disease caused by not getting enough vitamin C. It is almost insulting in its simplicity. This was not some mysterious jungle curse or dramatic battle with the elements alone. It was the nutritional equivalent of forgetting the basics while running a giant, prestigious operation. Bering led a grand state-backed expedition and still got taken out by the most stereotypical maritime failure imaginable. It is like building a magnificent machine and then forgetting to include one tiny part that keeps the whole thing alive. 18. William Dampier lived like two completely different people sharing one body and refusing to compromise. On one side, he was a sharp observer of nature, carefully recording exotic plants, animals, winds, coastlines, and ecosystems with the detail of a serious scientific mind. On the other side, he was also a pirate, which tends to complicate the peaceful image. So his life became this bizarre mashup of intellectual curiosity and criminal enthusiasm. One moment, he was basically composing careful field notes on the habits of strange birds or fish. The next moment, he was raiding ships, burning towns, and helping himself to somebody else's rum supply. It is hard to think of another explorer whose journals could pivot so casually from scientific insight to outright felony. Dampier was not a neat, heroic type. He was a brilliant observer with terrible career boundaries, the sort of naturalist who might describe a shell species beautifully and then rob you before sunset. 19. When Hernando de Soto marched through what is now the southeastern United States, he brought the usual gear of conquest: weapons, armor, ambition, and disaster. He also brought pigs, which at first sounds practical. Portable food, easy breeding, handy supply line with hooves. What he actually unleashed was a squealing catastrophe. The pigs multiplied fast, escaped easily, and spread into the landscape as feral populations that tore up crops and transformed local ecosystems. Worse still, they likely carried diseases that helped fuel deadly epidemics among indigenous communities already facing unimaginable pressure from European contact. So De Soto's pigs were not just dinner on legs. They were biological chaos with snouts. He marched in with steel and ended up also scattering a four-legged nightmare across the region. It is one of history's darkest examples of unintended consequences. A military expedition showed up, and somehow the pig still managed to become one of its most destructive legacies. 20. The Spanish developed a conquest ritual so absurd it sounds like satire, except it was real, and people were expected to treat it seriously. Before attacking indigenous communities, officials would read out a document called the Requerimiento. This long declaration explained the world according to Spanish religious and royal authority and demanded submission to a distant monarch the listeners had never heard of. There was just one tiny flaw, if by tiny you mean completely ridiculous. It was usually read in Spanish to people who did not understand a word of it. So the conquerors could basically mumble a legal speech into the air, receive no meaningful response, and then claim the other side had refused a reasonable offer. It was the imperial version of reading terms and conditions to a stranger and taking their silence as surrender. The whole thing existed to soothe consciences while making violence sound procedural. Bureaucratic nonsense now with swords. 21. Roald Amundsen was a legend of polar exploration, which makes his North Pole aviation disaster even funnier in the most dangerous possible way. This was the man who mastered brutal environments, conquered the South Pole, and navigated the Northwest Passage. Then he decided to tackle the Arctic by air using large Dornier flying boats that were magnificently unsuited to landing on sea ice. Unsurprisingly, the mission turned into a mess. The aircraft came down on unstable ice in the middle of nowhere, leaving the crew stranded in one of the least forgiving places on Earth. For weeks they hacked, scraped, and carved at the ice trying to create a runway by hand so one plane could somehow take off. Elite explorers, world-class achievements, and yet they had engineered a situation so foolish it looked like survival was now being managed by panic and stubbornness alone. They escaped, barely, but only after proving genius does not cancel out terrible transport decisions. 22. Ferdinand Magellan gets credit for the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe, which is fair enough for the voyage, but not exactly for him personally because he did not make it around. Why not? Because he decided to meddle in a local conflict in the Philippines like a man who had mistaken arrogance for invincibility. After making alliances with local rulers, Magellan agreed to help one side crush a rival community. He marched onto the beach with a small force, clearly expecting his armor, weapons, and swagger to terrify everyone into submission. Instead, the defenders fought back hard, and Magellan found himself trapped in shallow water, overwhelmed, and killed. He did not die on the edge of the unknown in some grand symbolic moment of discovery. He died because he inserted himself into somebody else's neighborhood fight and assumed he would dominate it. Spectacular sailor, dreadful judgment, fatal overconfidence. 23. The Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus, but the way one of them first spotted it is so underwhelming it almost feels like a joke. Bjarni Herjolfsson was trying to sail from Iceland to Greenland to visit his father when storms pushed him off course. Out there, he saw land that was almost certainly part of North America. This should have been one of the great dramatic moments in exploration. New coastline, unknown world, history calling. And Bjarni basically responded with, "That is not where I was trying to go." He did not land. He did not investigate. He did not claim anything. He just kept moving because he was more interested in getting to Greenland than becoming wildly famous. It is one of the funniest near-mythic shrugs in history. Imagine stumbling across a new continent and reacting like someone annoyed that the exit on the highway is not the one they wanted. Truly legendary indifference. 24. Matthew Flinders achieved one of the great feats of navigation by circumnavigating and naming Australia, which should have earned him triumph, respect, and maybe a long vacation somewhere boring and comfortable. Instead, he got bureaucracy. On his return journey, ship problems forced him to stop at Mauritius, which was controlled by France during wartime with Britain. The local governor was suspicious, petty, and apparently powered by paperwork. Flinders had scientific credentials and peaceful intentions, but the governor decided his documents were not good enough and treated him like a spy. So the man who had mapped an entire continent ended up imprisoned on a small island for 6 years because one official chose paranoia over reason. It is one of the most infuriating endings in exploration history. Flinders beat ocean, distance, and hardship, only to get absolutely wrecked by administrative pettiness. Nothing says hero's reward quite like rotting in detention over forms. 25. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, dreamed big. He wanted a French colony at the mouth of the Mississippi and imagined himself carving out a serious, imperial future in North America. There was just one problem so enormous it should have ended the plan immediately. He missed the Mississippi by about 400 miles. 400. That is not a tiny navigational error. That is wandering into the wrong reality. He landed in what is now Texas, then spent years blundering along the coast trying to find the giant river he had somehow misplaced. His men had to endure bad leadership, worsening morale, and the creeping realization that they were following a man whose confidence was wildly stronger than his accuracy. Eventually, the expedition cracked. Mutineers ambushed and killed La Salle in the middle of nowhere. His imperial dream did not collapse in battle against rivals. It collapsed because he got lost on a colossal scale. 26. Zebulon Pike was given a task that sounds simple enough on paper: explore the southern part of the Louisiana Purchase and gather useful information without doing anything too embarrassing. He failed that second part magnificently. Pike wandered around with such unreliable direction that it feels generous to call it navigation at all. He missed objectives, lost the plot, and somehow drifted deep into Spanish territory in what is now Colorado. When Spanish soldiers found him, they were reportedly baffled. Was he a spy, an invader, a confused officer, or just a man with the world's worst internal compass? They arrested him, took his maps and documents, and escorted him out. Politely, which somehow makes it funnier. Pike later got a mountain named after him, but his broader expedition often feels less like purposeful exploration and more like a long, federally funded wrong turn. He discovered things mostly by failing hard enough to run into them. In 27, Martin Frobisher looked at a black shiny rock in Canada and apparently decided that scientific caution was for lesser men. Instead of testing it properly, he declared it valuable ore and rushed back to England with the confidence of someone who had definitely not just fallen in love with a random stone. People believed him. Money poured in. A second expedition was launched, not so much to explore as to gather industrial quantities of this supposed treasure. Frobisher hauled back around 1,500 tons of the stuff, which is a lot of effort for what turned out to be basically useless rock. When experts finally examined it properly, the Golden Dream collapsed into national embarrassment. The precious haul was eventually crushed and used for roads. So after all the hype, all the expense, and all the heroic enthusiasm, Frobisher's great mineral legacy became glorified gravel. He did not discover gold. He discovered the dangers of being emotionally manipulated by shiny objects. 28. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville had the kind of idea that sounds strategic only if you ignore geography, diplomacy, and common sense all at once. He decided France should establish a colony on the Falkland Islands, a remote, windy cluster of rocks in the South Atlantic that was already tangled in imperial claims and tension. So he planted a French project there anyway, because apparently the best way to spend national energy was to create an international headache in a place mostly famous for sheep and weather that hates human happiness. Predictably, Spain was furious because it considered the islands its own. Britain was also interested because of course it was. Suddenly, Bougainville's tiny colonial side project was helping stir a serious dispute among major European powers. He eventually had to back down and leave, having achieved almost nothing except provoking everyone. It was a masterclass in how to turn a bleak island outpost into a multinational diplomatic migraine. 29. Percy Fawcett became consumed by the idea that a magnificent lost city was hidden deep in the Amazon, a place he called the Lost City of Z. His evidence was thin, speculative, and held together mostly by hope, old reports, and the sort of confidence that should usually set off alarm bells. But Fawcett did not just believe in it. He built his life around it. He dragged his son and his son's friend into the jungle on a quest that had drifted far from cautious exploration and deep into obsession. then they vanished completely. No confirmed trace, no neat ending, just silence and endless theories. That is the brutal irony. Fawcett spent years chasing a legendary lost city and ended up becoming the lost mystery himself. He was part explorer, part dreamer, part man who could not let go of a fantasy. History remembers him not for what he found, but for how thoroughly he disappeared. 30. The Franklin expedition was supposed to represent the future of polar exploration. Powerful ships, advanced equipment, careful provisioning, years of supplies, the full polished image of modern imperial competence. And then the canned food happened. One of the expedition's supposed technological advantages was a huge stock of preserved meals, but the cans had been produced in a rush and sealed badly with lead-heavy solder. So while Franklin's men were trapped in Arctic ice, dealing with cold, isolation, and dwindling hope, they were also slowly poisoning themselves every time they ate. It is almost too darkly ironic to process. The very innovation meant to improve their odds may have helped destroy them from the inside. Their ships became floating prisons stocked with contaminated survival food, which is the kind of progress that deserves a standing ovation from nobody. It was cutting-edge logistics wrapped around a fatal manufacturing disaster. Technology tried to help and mostly made death more efficient. 31. Abel Tasman had a truly remarkable gift for discovering important places while somehow dodging the gigantic thing he was actually meant to understand. He was sent out to help determine the extent of Australia, a continent large enough that you would think missing it entirely should require active effort. Instead, Tasman discovered Tasmania, then New Zealand, then Fiji, and still managed to avoid properly seeing the Australian mainland in the way his mission really required. It is honestly impressive. He kept finding islands and coastlines like a man searching for an elephant, but getting distracted by every interesting pebble in the room. No one can say he lacked skill. He was an excellent sailor and a significant explorer. But his voyage remains one of history's great examples of being extremely competent in every direction except the one that actually matters. He had one giant target and somehow turned it into a side quest. 32. Christopher Columbus had spent so much time at sea that when his crew spotted large marine animals in the water, his brain apparently decided reality was optional. He saw manatees and wrote about mermaids. Not just mermaids, by the way, but disappointing mermaids. That is the truly ridiculous part. Instead of simply misidentifying the creatures and moving on, Columbus actually complained that they were not as beautiful as he had expected. Sir, you were looking at a massive sea cow with the face of a grumpy potato and the elegance of drifting furniture. The animal was not failing. Your expectations were. It is one of the funniest moments in exploration history because it combines myth, exhaustion, ego, and terrible observational judgment in one glorious package. Columbus reached lands unknown to Europeans and still found time to leave a negative review for wildlife because the imaginary women fish were not attractive enough for him. Now be honest, which one was the most pathetic failure on this list, and which explorer disaster did we absolutely miss? Drop your pick in the comments and defend it like your reputation depends on it. And if this video made you laugh and lose faith in human genius at the same time, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for more history at its weirdest and dumbest.